Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about a very unique subject that's not as common here in the West, though hopefully that will change in the future. It is very common in the East, however, and that is buying puerh to age, determining its worth, and investing in puerh. Now, investment is something I do not recommend anyone here in the West to consider investing in puerh. Though some people like to think about puerh tea as an investment or an asset that can appreciate over time because it can increase in value as well as change in taste profiles. That's why it's a drinkable antique. Now in Asia, many people will actively purchase tea, maybe because they don't feel the banks are as safe, but maybe something like puerh tea is a very safe investment because it always appreciates in time. However, things changed a lot during the puerh bubble. And the market started to crash. It started to get overfloated with all kinds of teas, low and high quality, which makes the market more difficult to manage and understand. But first, let's start about worth, the worth of tea. How can I determine the worth of a puerh tea if I'm buying to age? I want to buy good puerh tea and age it. First, the short answer to that is you should only buy a puerh you yourself understand and enjoy, that you can understand the value this tea has to yourself. This is the simplest way to do this. You don't want to be buying puerh. I've mentioned this before in previous videos. You don't want to drink a puerh that you find to your disliking. Buy some, or even worse, buy a lot based on someone else's recommendation or in hopes it will turn into something that you didn't like when you drank it. Most likely, puerh tea will never change a lot. It will keep a lot of its characteristics from the day you drank it. It'll either develop over time or mellow out over time. So only buy teas you thoroughly understand and enjoy. That's the simplest, easiest way to recommend and teach people how to invest. Because if you don't like it, it doesn't matter how valuable the tea may be in the future. If you don't thoroughly enjoy it and drink it, it'll be more difficult even to resell or find a secondary market. So if we move over to investment, what are some of the things I should think about if I'm going to consider investing in puerh, which once again, I do not usually strongly recommend doing here in the West. The first thing you want to look for if you're considering investing in puerh is you want to look at the brand. Does the brand of the tea you are thinking of buying have inherent value? What does that mean? That means if you were to purchase that tea and not drink it, would it have financial value? So that's the first thing you want to think about. Does the brand itself hold value? And then the second thing you want to look at is the secondary markets. Does that brand or tea have a secondary market? And what are secondary markets? Secondary markets mean that tea is being actively sold or resold by an individual or company that is not the producer of that tea. So someone else selling at a higher price than that tea was originally sold at. One thing you can help learn about and discover about secondary markets is maybe a secondary market or individual is selling that tea at a higher price, but are people actively buying that tea at that newly established price point? That's a very important thing to consider. And then you also will need to see if the brand has history. Now, if a brand does not have history, it's a very new company, it can be very difficult. Even if there appears to be a secondary market, it can be very difficult to do a technical analysis and look back through the track record of this company and its products to see if they have consistently, year after year, increased in price, sold out, been in high demand on a consistent basis. Maybe just one tea goes up in price, but the other teas on average decay or don't hold their value. That would also be a reason for concern. So we want to make sure the brand has an inherent value. We want to make sure there's a strong secondary market, and we want to make sure there is history to that company. So we can look back and see if there is a majority of their teas being sold at higher prices than when they were released. So those are the few things you should keep in consideration if you're considering to invest in tea. Things you should look at very deeply. Now, if a brand or tea does not have a secondary market, then it's probably not a good financial value or a financial investment. However, that's not to say that that tea couldn't have personal value to you or personal worth. Once again, going back to buying teas you enjoy. But if they don't have a secondary market, then it's probably not a good financial investment. Then the next thing you want to consider, this is all assuming that there is a strong market and network for you to easily and readily sell your teas. Now, if you have a lot of tea, good brand, good product, and good market, the next thing you need to think about is how can you as an individual sell that tea? Is it likely you have a small business willing to buy that tea back from you, or another individual collector willing to buy from you? So sometimes you need to develop the network in order for that to even be possible. And here in the West, I really don't feel like that network's really established, though that is something that I look forward to building here on Patreon and the community, to allow others to be purchasing and reselling their Puerh tea through a network, which I will be able to help and assist with that, which ultimately helps grow the market in whole. So that's one thing I'm interested in doing. Now, if you've kind of gotten those things down, you also want to separate different distinguishing categories. In the past, what I have seen is teas from ancient tea trees or old tea trees or famous mountains tend to hold their value regardless of market fluctuations. Those are always in demand because there's a very scarce amount of old tea tree material and there's a very abundant amount of small bush material. So if we go into small bushes, this market is more difficult to invest in because there's so much volatility, there's so much market saturation, and there's so many wild claims about this tea is from old trees or not old tea trees, and it can be difficult to navigate. So usually small bush teas, you want to always go to big established companies or factories, Shaguan, Manghai, Dai. Though, in my personal experience, I've seen if you're thinking about bigger factories, you probably want to purchase teas that were prior to 2004. Though some people have seen investments in those big companies to pay off quite well. There's usually, a small percentage increase over the years if you are lucky enough to buy out a big production of Shaguan, and then you can wait a few years and hopefully you have someone you can sell at a small profit. I personally don't do that because I find it to be extremely risky. You're almost betting, you're almost gambling. You're hoping one of these mass productions will go up in value magically, or someone will buy it out, or someone will have hype in the market to say that this tea will increase in value. It just doesn't have the financial risk reward for me to consider an investment like that. Where teas from established companies that are from older and ancient tea trees, there is a very steady increase and appreciation of the tea that sometimes can be upwards to 10-15% per year. So when I'm looking at that investment, there is a higher risk to reward. So if a famous mountain old tree tea, something like Yiwu, went up substantially, maybe 100% in a few years, I could sell it at 60 or 70% of the market price and be very happy with that investment. Where something with bigger productions or small bushes, maybe I can only make a few percent increase as the market goes up, but then it may be very difficult for me to sell because there's an abundant amount of that tea already on the market. And maybe for that investment to pay off, I would need to wait 5, 10, 20, 30 years for that tea to get developed and get scarce. Where teas like from ancient mountains, ancient arbor material or famous mountains, there is a higher appreciation year to year, so I don't have to hold it on as long if I need to liquidate my assets. So there's a few things to consider. Now the next thing would be I'm ready to invest and purchase some Puerh. How do I do that? It's very difficult to invest in Puerh by buying a single cake. If you buy a single cake, there's a lot of vulnerability that can happen. Your storage condition. There can be aromas that can be picked up in this cake. How is it stored? And there's also the mindset from the buyer, someone who's interested in buying your tea, if you want to resell it. Is if you just have a cake or two, maybe you aren't a serious collector. Maybe you haven't paid close attention to your storage condition. Now, I'm not saying you have or haven't. I'm just saying some of the mindset I have seen with the companies I have worked for in Yunnan, when purchasing a small quantity of tea. There's just more risk for the buyer. They don't know how you're storing your tea. They don't know where this tea cake was put or placed, how many years it was there, if there's any kind of damage internally to the tea. So it's usually very difficult to purchase single cakes and hope to resell them or invest them later. Though single cakes are perfect for your own personal investment if you want to see how a tea ages in the future and revisit that tea. If you want to invest, you almost always need tongs, meaning keep them in the original tong format. Even better yet, cases. And this is where it starts to get very financially heavy because you have to buy cases of Puerh. Why would you want to keep a case intact? Why does that have more value? Well, it has less risk for the buyer buying the tea from you. Because if it's in its original case from the factory or original tong, it's less likely that tea was tampered with. And this becomes increasingly more important as the tea ages and it becomes aged tea. Because there is a very small amount of aged tea, especially from old tea trees, the price point gets very, very expensive. And this sounds kind of counterintuitive. As the tea gets more expensive, why would someone be willing to buy more, like a tong versus a cake? Because there's less risk when buying an original tong or case. There is much more risk in buying a single cake. If it's an old tea that's gotten very expensive, there's more ways for this tea cake to be tampered with. The wrapper can be changed. The raw material could be different than what it was said. So that just keeps the tea in its original tact. Now that being said, you also have to keep in mind, if you want to do that, do you know people in your network that are crazy enough to buy tongs and cases of tea? Because most likely, if you started to heavily invest in some very expensive teas, you will probably need to sell to your network first if you want to get the most return on your investment. The next thing would be to go to larger companies, which here in the West, I don't really know that many companies that are willing to buy back their own teas at a premium. There is a few, and there's not really collectors that are willing to pay that much. Though in China, what I've seen working with companies like Danong, what they will do is they will buy back some of these earlier productions from their own company, buy back from their customers at maybe a 50-60% markup from what they paid, but then be able to sell on the market at a significantly higher price or go to auction. So now we kind of have this thought process going through. So it's once again very tricky. You want to be very careful with this. I don't strongly recommend that. So if we look at myself, why am I investing in Puerh? Well, if I want to be very open with you and transparent with you on how this works, I love and I'm very passionate about Puerh, and I want to make this a livelihood. I don't really want to do that by relying on a sale of a product. So instead, I want to create education and share my experience. At the same time, I also want to build a very large inventory of Puerh that at a later date I can use for education, teaching about aged teas, teaching about how teas change and develop, what is the taste of old tea trees. And at that same time, what I am doing is I am building my own network to be able to resell these teas at a later date. So I'm actually protecting the market value by helping educate. If there isn't a long, strong push to help educate the market, it'll be very difficult and maybe completely unlikely that people will be able to engage in investing or reselling of Puerh teas. So all this process is very important. And that's what I hope to do with this Patreon, is to be able to build that network. So you yourself could say, I'm interested in purchasing this tea, but it's very difficult to get a hold of. And I can reach out to the network, find someone who has an abundant amount of that tea, willing to sell it maybe a little bit below market value, but obviously they're profiting quite well off that, and build that network to build that circulation so people can get an honest, true connection to make sure their tea is authentic and a true source. I can help validate that along the way, and people can experience those teas. And also they can purchase tea more confidently, knowing they might be able to resell it if the time comes and they need to do something like that. So I hope this video helped you in understanding the worth and the risks of investment, and also determining a tea on what is best to age. Remember, only buy teas you thoroughly enjoy and understand. Don't buy teas based on someone else's recommendation or in hopes it will turn into something that you don't like the day you drink it. And of course, anytime if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much.